Kia ora, Clint Risman here from Land and Water Science. I'm the Principal Scientist and Technical Director. Today we're going to explore a little more about the role that the landscape plays over water quality and soil greenhouse gases. My objective is to try and unpack some of the content so that you can access it a lot better. I'd like to invite you to contemplate something really important, and that is the role that Mother Nature plays in determining water quality and soil greenhouse gas outcomes. So modern research is indicating that the landscape is responsible for at least 2 times the spatial variability in water quality and soil greenhouse gases than land use on its own. Now, to think about that and to provide you with some more context, I can provide a really simple example. You have 2 farms side by side doing exactly the same thing. Potentially the same enterprise type, same type of management styles, the same set of mitigations and requirements, but you're getting completely different water quality outcomes. One neighbour might have groundwater nitrate issues in their shallow aquifer, the other one doesn't. Why? Is it because one's a better farmer than the other? No. It's basically related to the landscape underneath their feet. So you can have the same land use side by side and get completely different outcomes. Today I want to explore why and what those fundamental controls relate to. One of the things when we look outside or in a plane or we're driving through the landscape, we see things that are really we recognize intuitively. That one's a mountain, an alpine environment, or here's some hill country, or look, we're driving next to a river. These are characteristic landforms, and those landforms are associated with very unique settings, and those settings are different, and because they're different, they respond very differently to land use. So a farm occurring in hill country versus a farm occurring on the lowland gravel or a lowland alluvial plain are actually having to deal with very different landscape settings. And those landscape settings fundamentally affect the type of water quality outcomes, the type of soil greenhouse gases that occur. Now, it's not just at a landform level. Obviously there's climatic variability, there's your geology. Within the geology there's your soil, and your geology also encompasses what's beneath our feet. And it's really interesting, you can get completely different water. A lot of people know this. They'll talk about their water being hard or soft. Hard water is when you have lots of calcium and magnesium or even iron in the water, and other places they've got very soft water. Why? Again, it's the geology. The type of rock you have fundamentally influences the composition of water at atomic level. It also influences the response of the landscape to your land use. If you're in an area where you have well-drained soils, and I think of many parts of New Zealand, the Canterbury Plains or parts of the Waikato across the pumice area, those soils, the water moves down without being interrupted, it percolates down to an aquifer. In those settings, nitrate is often a key issue. It's not being removed as it moves through the soil to an aquifer. You go to another part of New Zealand, or even within the same region, just down the road, you might find an area where you have the same well-drained soils, but underneath there's a completely different geology associated with the aquifer. And that aquifer system may actually naturally remove nitrate. So those differences are really fundamental. If you're looking at something that's just identifying how much you're losing from the top 600 mils of your soil, that's not telling you the story of what's actually controlling variability and water quality. New Zealand's really geologically diverse, and we just need to compare it with our next door neighbour Australia, and you can see that in Australia they have some soil types that actually go for thousands of kilometres fairly much uninterrupted. But in New Zealand, you can barely walk 100 metres without encountering a different type of soil. The reason is New Zealand's one of the most tectonically active, so that means the plates coming together in places where they come together. We have the Southern Alps, we've got active uplift and movement. Parts of the North Island, there's active volcanism. Not many people realise this, but I think the central plateau in the Taupo volcanic zone produces more rhyolitic magma than just about any other place in the world, perhaps only second to Yellowstone. We have, I guess for many geologists around the world, what would be considered Mecca. We can see things occurring in New Zealand and at scales that you'd have to travel thousands of kilometres elsewhere to see. New Zealand is hugely unique, and because of that dynamic landscape setting, we have such a diversity of landform type, climate zones, and also soils. They all interact together to result in quite a complex mosaic of environments for our water, but also in terms of soil greenhouse gas production. There are very few places in the world you can go to and see the same amount of variability as what you see in New Zealand. So it really doesn't make sense to treat all farms the same. Geology is so important when you think about it in a broader context. Geology is the thing that's determined the form of the landscape, the elevation, the ruggedness. So geology actually controls topography, not the other way around. And that's why it's really important to identify how things like slope and erodibility vary across the landscape with geology. For example, weak rocks like mudstone, they fail at lower slope angles than strong rocks. Therefore, it doesn't always make sense to apply an arbitrary or uniform slope threshold to explain risk, because there are many areas where the risk could be higher at a lower slope or lower, depending on the fundamentals of the landscape. So topography is really important, but ultimately it's controlled by geology. Recognizing that control is really important. For example, we can see that in some areas, a slope threshold of 10 degrees may not result in overland flow and runoff. Why? Because the geology is permeable and the soils that it develops are more permeable. The water can move into the landscape. You can have exactly the same slope and have a geology that's poorly permeable, like mudstone, and the soils that form are also poorly permeable. The water can't get in as quickly, so it runs off. So it's really important to contextualize topography and geology together. Applying an arbitrary slope threshold without registering the actual landscape can be really challenging to get the type of environmental outcomes we're looking for. When we're thinking about our environment, and particularly in pastoral production systems, unfortunately we've often looked at the top 7.5 centimetres. That a soil test that they take on most farms for fertiliser application is 7.5 centimetres. It's barely scraping the surface of what's actually controlling variability and water quality in soil greenhouse gases. We have to take a much more integrated look to make sense of the variability we're seeing. And I think this is part of the issue, is that we've often just looked at this much or this much and said that's the whole story. And it's not. It's fundamentally not. And we can't explain the variability we're seeing in our water quality in particular through taking a really reductionist view, particularly in a geologically diverse country like New Zealand. So from a land user's perspective, and taking a really, hey, what's on your farm vantage point, What's really important is that we get a sense of what the underlying controls are at a property scale and at a paddock scale. In some places, with some of the data sets that we're using, we can get right down to sub-paddock and finer. And what's important about that is we get a sense of what the underlying DNA of the property is. And that's so important because then we can really tune a local investment in mitigation and farm management to your setting. And given how diverse New Zealand is, that's essential, because if you do not match your investment, or if you do not match the actions that you're taking to the things on the ground that are controlling water quality and soil greenhouse gases, there's a real risk of misalignment. You could put in a huge amount of effort and not get the type of outcomes you're seeking or looking for. That's why it's really important to be aware of your landscape. And I think that's the cool thing about farmers, is that they know their land. And that local knowledge, in conjunction with this holistic framework of how Mother Nature controls outcomes, is really important. So back your knowledge of your landscape. Use that in conjunction with the knowledge that we provide around water quality, around how the landscape controls water quality and soil greenhouse gases, and use that to be strategic in your investment. Geology is fundamental. We talk about as what we call a first order control. Ultimately, the landscape that we see, the type of soils that we have, even our local climate is controlled by geology. For example, there's more rainfall at the top of Mount Cook, Aoraki, than there is at the coast. Why? Because the mountains drive the amount of rainfall as a cloud ascends. So it's that fundamental. So geology in New Zealand is really diverse, so diverse. And that geology is really the secret to unlocking our understanding of the landscape. It is the first order control over water quality and soil greenhouse gases. Why? Because it's also the first order control over the type of soils that form and our climate. In pre-human times, it also determined the type of plant communities that you would have across the landscape. So understanding your geology is so fundamental, and that's what we do. That's what we bring, is that landscape context to the how and why of the variability that you see on your property or across your catchment.